So today I'll be showing you how to sample vegetation using a variety of different techniques such as the quadrants and the transect line. Now these techniques, obviously we can sample vegetation to check out the distribution, the biodiversity and abundance of plant species in our core study area, and this way we can see the ecological importance of species in that area as well. So the size of the study area will also determine the size of the quadrants and the sampling techniques that we'll be using. So for today, just for demonstration purposes, we will be doing a smaller scale quadrant just to make sure that we can show you how it's done, how we can have a look at the species within the quadrant and how we can record it after we've seen those species. So we do need a few tools for this demonstration this afternoon. Also too, if we do have larger trees and larger species within the area, we do need to make sure that we have like a tape measure to make sure we can measure the diameter of the stem. But for today, we mainly just need to have a look at the observational side of things for the smaller species. So we do have this quadrant here. Obviously it's quite small. Usually it's about 1 metre by 1 metre. But just for demonstration purposes, we've just gone a smaller scale just to show you what we can look for. Also, we do have a transect line. So basically, it's just attached to the base of a tree here, going in a nice straight line to the smaller stick stuck in the ground about 3 metres away from the first point. Also too, we need a tape measure and a string, and also we do need some very basic equipment such as a pen, paper. You could also have a GPS to make sure you mark out the coordinates of your plots, your vegetation sampling plots, and you can also take a computer with you as well so that you can directly upload any data that you might be getting from your samples.
Here is a list of some other types of equipment that is also used for vegetation sampling.
So to make sure we don't have any bias in our data or our sampling, we need to make sure that we do pick a random position to make sure that we can see a variety of different species in our sample area. So a common way to do this is just by grabbing a stick, a rock, or any object really. A fluorescent object would even be better for very vegetated areas, and basically just chucking it over your shoulder and going and see where it lands. So if we come over to here, the first point where it lands is where we'll start our transect line. So standing where it lands, once again, facing your back to the study area, throwing it over your shoulder again. And this point where it lands this time is where our transect line will end. So now that we've got our transect line, we need to mark out the points where we're going to drop our quadrant. These can be predetermined points, but for demonstration purposes, we're just going to measure out 1 metre, go along the line, make a mark, and once again from where this mark is, we go along 1 metre again. And then from here we can grab our quadrant and really simply just place the corner of the quadrant on the mark and then just simply let it drop. So this vegetation sampling here, using the quadrant, this can be part of the procedure for a census. Now if you take down the GPS coordinations of where you actually did your sampling, you can come back at a later date and do a recensus. But it's really important that you do it over the same period of time. So say you did the first census over 4 to 5 weeks, make sure you do this recensus over 4 to 5 weeks as well, and make sure you do it at the same time of year and same time of day. That way you can get a nice accurate reading of the types of vegetation that are in the area. So once we've laid down the quadrant, we can see the actual boundaries that we're going to be looking within. So any of the species that we include within the boundaries, they need to be at least 50% of their total area within the boundaries. Anything that's smaller than 50% we don't include. So if, for example, this weed here, it's definitely more than 50% within the boundary, so we are going to be including it in our sampling process. So first of all, we will have a look in one of the smaller squares that we've created in our quadrant plot here to have a look at the species that are present. So as we can see there's grass, we can see there's a weed and there's also some fungi as well. There's also a lot of dead leaf litter as well, and a few sticks, and we'll be getting to that very shortly. So first of all, we need to write down the types of species that are present. So this is where we're going to get our notepad out and just make sure we do write down. So I can see that there's grass, fungi, and also weeds. Obviously, we'd have to determine what type of species they are to get a more accurate set of data. But for now, just for demonstration purposes, I'm just going to write that down so that everyone can understand what I'm pointing at. So next we need to see the percentage of each of the species that is present within this square. So it's basically an estimate of how much, say for example the grass. So the grass is about, I'd say there's about 20% of the square is covered in grass. So grass, 20%. So for the weed, I'd say that only about 15% of the square is covered in that weed plant there. So weed, 15%, sorry. And the fungi, it only comes up to about, I'd say, 1 to 2%. 2%. So next we need to look at the percentage of light that's covering the quadrant itself. So light can be really important in determining what type of species is going to be present. So more light dependent species will be in the areas that do get the more light shown on them throughout the day, whereas the non-light dependent species, they'll be in the areas that does get predominantly shaded throughout the day. So currently it's quite late in the afternoon, and as you can see, we're only really getting about 10 to 15% of the quadrant covered in light. The rest is shaded, so we're going to record that down. So 10 to 15%. So lastly, in our quadrant plot, we're just going to have a look at and have a measurement of how much dead leaf litter is currently on top of the soil. So the dead leaf litter consists of anything that's not alive anymore. So this could be dead grass, leaves that have fallen from a tree above, sticks, twigs, anything that's just above the soil. So basically all we need to do is just get our pinky finger and just very lightly push all the dead leaf litter to the side until you reach the soil. So from here, we grab our tape measure and measure the amount, and that only comes to 9 mils. So then we write that down in our table, and we can have that for future reference to see how much of the ground is covered in dead leaf litter and how much vegetation occurs as well. So in larger sampling areas, we may need to use larger quadrants. So these can be 1 hectare quadrants, for example. So basically we will be seeing larger species of vegetation, such as large trees like this behind me. So when we do come across these larger species of trees, we can't visually just have a look at our what's present in our quadrant. So we do need to take the diameter and the circumference of the trunk. So anything that has a diameter of 10 centimeters or more outlined in the protocol, that's what we're going to be measuring in our sample. So we measure up about 1.3 meters from the ground. We can do that on here. So about there. And all we need to do is just take the tape measure right around the tree, measure where it overlaps. So and that's 92 centimeters around. Once we have measured it, we do need to mark the tree to make sure that we know we have actually measured that tree and it doesn't get doubled up. So we can mark it with a crayon or a marker. Also you can paint with a non-emulsifying paint with a stencil on the tree, and you can also, it is required to put an aluminium tag nailed into the tree with an aluminium nail with a nail on a downwards angle. One thing to remember as well, to minimize any errors in your measuring today, to make sure that you have multiple people doing the work in the group. So the measurer will yell out the measurement to the note taker, and it's important that the note taker yells back that measurement to the measurer, as this prevents any errors before they do record it down in the data. So once you have gotten all your data and it's recorded down on your piece of paper, on your sampling sheet, you can come back to a computer and just add it into Excel. Excel is probably the best way to add your data into a database. That way you can make any graphs, tables, and compare any species that are present in one area and not in the other. So I hope you've learned a little bit about sampling vegetation this afternoon using a variety of different techniques such as the transect line, the vegetation plots, and the quadrants. A few pros and cons to do with the proposal, however. A few pros is that it's simple, it's easy to follow. They go over all the procedures in very good detail, and that there's plenty of people involved in the sampling process, and this minimises errors. A few cons though is that it's labour intensive, it costs a lot of money for the equipment and also the staff that are hired, and also it does take a fair bit of time. So there's a few pros and cons, but overall it's a really easy way to sample the vegetation. You can do it in your backyard, you can do it in larger scale areas like fields or paddocks, just to check out what type of vegetation species are there, and also just to have a little bit of a play around sampling vegetation.